Ed, thank you so much for joining, and it's great to have you on.
Pleasure. Nice to be here, mate.
For people who may have not come across you, let's just start with your earliest memory of you as a rugby player, young lad getting into rugby. Like, what was the inspiration for getting into rugby as a young lad?
The motivation actually is quite funny. The motivation was because I hated swimming so much. So let me just put that into context for you. So swimming was my main sport when I was a kid, and I did enough of it and got good enough of it at it to get a scholarship to a school called Millfield down in the southwest, which took it surprisingly seriously. And I was sort of a national level swimmer at 14 and ended up going to the best swimming school in the country, but that meant training at 5 a.m. every morning before school, and it only took about 2 or 3 weeks for me to go, I don't want to do this anymore, which my parents were pretty dismayed about because I had to give my scholarship back. But then I just wanted to do what my mates were doing, and most of them were playing rugby and cricket. So they were the two sports that I picked up then. And then I suppose my first memories of rugby were I wasn't as good as everyone else because they'd been playing it for a lot longer than me. But then I think my size and I suppose fitness levels from swimming, and I picked it up quite quickly. And 2 years later, I found myself captaining England under 16. So it was quite a quick progression, I suppose. And that was me for the next 15 years or so.
So what type of kid would you describe yourself as?
I would say up until that point that I started playing rugby, I was relatively shy and reserved and liked keeping to myself. I was brought up, we lived out in the sticks when I was growing up, and I was just involved in individual sports, namely swimming and tennis. And I was probably quite uncomfortable in social situations, just used to go to school, keep my head down, train, come home. But then when I was 13, I ended up going to boarding school, obviously, as I just mentioned. So that was a bit of a shock to the system, being in a boarding house with 50 other lads, all of them older than you. You sort of learn to look after yourself pretty quickly. You have to. And then rugby, of course, playing team sports brought me out of my shell a bit. And I probably realised that I wasn't naturally introverted. It was more the circumstances and environment I was in that made me that way. And then when I was put in a different environment, different circumstances, then it brought me out of my shell, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess going from swimming to a team sport, I actually went the other way. Like when I finished cricket, I actually did a year of swimming, and that was actually wild. Like just going from interacting with people all day to cannot hear anyone, cannot talk to anyone. You get a split moment of talking to someone, and yeah, it was a really interesting way. So yeah, quite interesting to go the other way actually. It's very, very different.
I enjoy the solitude of swimming now. Actually, I've actually just got back into it. I cannot swim in a pool though. The dotted lines in the middle of a lane still give me PTSD from when I've had to do it when I was a kid. But yeah, I love open water swimming, and if I'm anywhere near the sea, especially if it's somewhere warmer, I'll just get my goggles on and head off around the coastline. And it's good exercise for me now. I'm sure we'll get onto it, but with my current sort of physical situation, being non-weight bearing and all of those sorts of things, I'm probably better in water than I am on land now. So I do try and utilise it as much as possible.
Yeah, right. So just from that young lad that's then under 16 England player, and then starting to perhaps get into the system much more thoroughly, and then you eventually turn pro. What was your journey through being a pro like?
I mean, it started off with a pretty steep trajectory, considering I didn't really start playing till I was about 14, and then I got a pro contract when I was 17 for when I left school. So I went to Bath, which was my sort of local club. I was from Bath anyway, so that was pretty cool, having sort of sat in the stands as a youngster and then playing for that club. When I was 19, though, I dislocated my shoulder just as things were kicking off. I just made my debut, sort of senior debut, and I think it was from, actually looking back now and speaking to a lot of people who've had recurring shoulder injuries from when they're professionals. A lot of them used to be swimmers in their former life, which is quite interesting. I think over mobile shoulders from fly and things like that. But that was okay. But then when I came back, I had one game back and dislocated it again. So I ended up having about 2 years out of the game. I nearly retired at 20. So it seemed like it was coming to a grinding halt. And then I just sort of take one more stab at it, moved up to Doncaster and played in the Championship. And then my career kicked on from there. Then went to London Welsh, won the Championship with London Welsh, went to Premiership, and then the rest of my career was in the Premiership and in the Pro 14, so the top English and Welsh leagues. I played for Wasps and Dragons up until I finished in 2017.
Just going back to that 20-year-old that got injured and potentially was going to have to pack it in, who was around you that helped you, or was there anything you sort of did in that moment, or just made a decision in that moment with people or on your own? Because you can go two paths there, really, can't you? You can just go, I'm done, this is not for me, my shoulders are super mobile, I'm not built for this. Or you went the other way. What was it that got you down that road?
I think the rehab wise, you're going through the motions. Emotionally, it was quite a tough one to deal with, especially when I got injured the second time. I sort of felt like the world was out to get me a bit. But you're rehabbing, so you're just turning up and you're in the system. So you're going to physio, you're going to retraining, you're going to therapy. It's very different in professional sport, as you know. Like when you're rehabbing from something, you're following a routine. Whereas if you're having to get up and do it yourself and motivate yourself, it's more difficult. And that's a process. That's sort of where I've been the last few years. But actually carrying on and taking another stab at it in the championship was probably more down to the fear of not being a rugby player than wanting to be a rugby player. Like, I think that's all I kind of knew was sport from a young age. Yeah. And the idea of like going to uni and studying was quite terrifying. So it was more just trying to stay in my comfort zone. But ironically, it was, I'd gone from Bath, which at the time one of the top Premiership clubs, to Doncaster in the Championship, which, as well as just a sort of drop in terms of sort of on the sporting side, professionally, it was kind of a bit of a culture shock moving from the place I'd always lived to the middle of Yorkshire. And it actually turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to me at that time, because I was completely taken out of my comfort zone. I ended up playing nearly every week rather than just holding tackle bags for the first team. And it was terrifying to start with. And I think that was the first lesson for me in the benefits of getting outside your comfort zone and how change doesn't have to be negative. Like, I really didn't want to go up there, but actually it was less scary than not playing rugby. But it was probably the best thing I could have done, really, for my own personal development as a player, but also as a human being, I think.
Yeah, so many people could probably see that as like that step back. You're not progressing, you're not actually going forward. But game time is better than no game time. Getting out there, having that experience is better than not having that experience, I guess. And
just being valued, I think, was a big one. Even if it's, you're a bit more of a bigger fish in a smaller pond, I suppose, but people actually listen to your just being heard, even in the changing room or from reviews, and being respected a little bit more as a person and as a rugby player, because you had come from that Premiership or more elite setup. Whether that's right or not, I think there's real value in that. And even though it wasn't as prestigious as playing in the Premiership, it didn't matter. I felt so much better going to training every day, knowing that, I was actually a valued member of the squad.
Do you reckon you sort of built character within that moment, like sort of your expression of whether it's self-leadership, even those communication skills, being able to hold space in a room and actually have people listen to you, command a room and things like that maybe held you in good stead moving forward back up into the Premiership?
Yeah, for sure. I think so. I think we like to pigeonhole ourselves and say, well, I am a leader, or I'm not a leader, or I can speak in front of people, or I can't speak in front of people. But that might be true to a certain extent. There's obviously some innate ability in that for people, but I think often it's just exposure to it. So when you get forced into a situation where people are asking your advice, or you are being looked to for motivation, and that happens over and over again, you get more comfortable with it, and you realize, actually, maybe I could always do that. I just wasn't in the position to before. I didn't value myself enough to have the confidence to do that. And so moving to the Championship definitely made a difference from that, in the same way that moving to boarding school and being forced into a team environment when I thought I was introverted helped me come out of my shell. So yeah, I think there was a lot of there was a lot about the environment I was in that was a development in my personality, especially in that early stage.
And what sort of characteristics would you then describe yourself as a player that made you the professional you were? Like what sort of player were you, both on the field, off the field?
So I think fitness was always a big thing for me. I think coming from swimming, I was always sort of towards the top end of the pack in terms of that. So work rate was quite big. And game IQ, I suppose, that was always feedback I had. just being able to read the game well, not overwork, and communicate. Because I wasn't the biggest, strongest, quickest, so I had to make up for it in other ways, I suppose. They were probably the key ones. I also, that game IQ came into play because I managed to survive 10 years of professional rugby with base in the back row, with basically without ever making a tackle with my left shoulder because it was so messed up from all the operations. So you learn how to like talk to people, maneuver yourself in the defensive line, put people off running into you, all of those sorts of things. So I'd only tackle with my right. Certain coaches noticed it and would work around it. Some people never even noticed. I played for Wasps for 2 years. I don't think they ever even noticed I wasn't making the tackle with my left shoulder.
No one questioning it, and no one pulling you up on it at all. No one sort of going, you need to be doing this, and trying to mold you into something that didn't really either want to do or could do.
No, not really. I think it was just something that I realised I couldn't do, and I had to play to my strengths. So that became,
love that.
Work rate, ball carrying, and putting big shots in with the right shoulder. So whenever they do remember me making a tackle, it was a good one. So then your defence isn't questioned. So, it's the same as everyone's got their strengths and weaknesses, and some you should always try and improve your weaknesses. But mine was a structural one, which the operations couldn't help. So it didn't matter how technically good I was. I didn't want my arm to fall off. So I had to work around it in different ways.
Yeah, I don't know what you think about this, but I see a lot of people like in the world right now, whether this is in sport or anything, they're just constantly looking to improve a weakness and improve something that is, whether they deem it as a weakness or society may deem it as a weakness or not being good enough in certain area, and actually forgetting to just double down on a strength, like figure out what is it that can make you unique, what is it that can make you stand out, and then double down on that, and make that a super strength, make it the thing you're known for.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's really important, because you see it in like a community or a society, like the most successful tribes, for example. You can go back as far as you like. It's lots of people working together who are really good at the own thing that they own. So then the standard level is much higher. Whereas if everyone's just quite good at everything, then that's where the team, the end result, the end bar for the team sits. So I think doubling down on stuff and playing to your strengths and promoting people who are really good at things, and encouraging them to pull people forward with them is important. Having said that, depends how impactful that weakness can be. So if in sport, for example, if the weakness is going to be bad enough that you just couldn't play because you were that bad at that one thing, no matter how good you were at other things, you do need to work on it too. But I definitely agree with doubling down on strengths for sure. Yeah.
So let's go to 2017 and the accident. For people that may not have heard the story, I have heard the story. I've heard it, but for people who haven't, just talk through what happened on that day and what the outcome was.
Yeah. So I'd survived pretty much 10 years with not making any tackle, without any other shoulder surgeries from the first two I had at the start of my career. But then I did go and have another shoulder injury when I was 28 in 2017. I was playing for the Dragons. I was recovering from that, and I was at a good stage in my career. I was probably playing the best rugby of my career up until that point. I'd been speaking to the Welsh setup about potentially, on residency terms, going on a summer tour with Wales, which was really exciting. But yeah, it was a couple of months after my operation, and I was at a family friend's house just having a barbecue, and I went to use the pool. And they had a feature pool, so it wasn't, it had like a rocky embankment down one side and a waterfall. And I just dived in where the waterfall hit the water, not really concentrating, assuming it was deep, and it wasn't. It was only about 3 feet deep, and I hit my head so hard on the bottom of the pool that I broke my neck really badly, which rendered me completely paralysed and nearly drowned. Had to get resuscitated 3 times, and then spent the next week in intensive care with no movement or sensation returning, and was told after 9 days that I was never going to walk again. Was hoping to get the use of my arms back so that I could use a wheelchair. So yeah, life changed pretty quickly, that's for sure. But then after that, I was pretty lucky that I had some movement and sensation return. My toe flicked. I had that Kill Bill moment, staring at my toe, trying to get it to wiggle, and eventually it did. Right. And bit by bit, my body came back to the point where now I got out of a wheelchair after about 6 months and walking using crutches, and I built things up, and now I'm 6 years down the line, and I still have a lot of the underlying health conditions that go, like issues that go along with a spinal cord injury, but I am walking. I use artificial foot orthosis on the left, so I've got foot drop. I've got weakness all down through my left side from the hand down, and the right side functionally is a lot stronger, but I've got no sensation from the chest down on that side, temperature or pain. And then I'd have to deal with the underlying sort of conditions that go along with a spinal cord injury: bladder, bowel weakness, sexual function issues, temperature regulation issues, spasms, you name it. There's lots to go into neurological injuries. So that's the day-to-day admin. But to be honest, given where I was and what my diagnosis was, I'm pretty lucky to be where I am today.
And I mean, Lucky's the name of your book. And and actually, having listened to you before, and I think it was your podcast with James Haskell that I'd listened to, and it was actually you who changed my perspective on something like gratitude. And I think gratitude obviously is a very used word in the world right now. And I think a lot of people, because they overhear it, they can't really figure out how to use it sometimes. But I think lucky is such a different way of just shifting your mind into go, well, what am I lucky for? I think about my own life, and I think that I'm lucky with my condition and the outcomes of my condition and what I didn't have compared to other people. And then sort of lucky there's certain situations and all the different moments in my life that led up to that. And I think that then just instantly instills this sense of gratitude into what you do have rather than what you don't have. So I am curious to know, what your instant sort of moment when you woke up to find out your diagnosis. And I know you'd mentioned you got resuscitated on the ride back to the hospital, but actually, what was your mindset once you become conscious, you get told of it, and talk us through that moment?
Shock, really, initially. I think you're a bit numb to it. It doesn't feel real. You kind of feel like you're waiting to wake up from a nightmare, because it's one of those things that you hear happening to other people, but you don't ever assume it's going to happen to you. And then, yeah, of course, it slowly dawns on you and starts to sink in the magnitude of the situation. And during the day, it was okay, because you can distract yourself with the other people that were in the room, and you try and want to keep them positive, because I already felt guilty for what I was putting everyone through, especially my family. So you're trying to pretend you're fine, and you almost embody that, and you do feel fine. But then at night, when you're left with your own thoughts, and it was dark because I couldn't move a thing, and I couldn't even cough for myself properly. So I was lying on my back. So when any saliva went down my throat, I couldn't clear it. So it felt like I was drowning over and over again. So I had to learn to breathe through my nose and meditate. And of course, I couldn't move, so I couldn't press the buzzer for the staff and couldn't shout. So you just had to wait until someone came in and realized you were choking next door. So that was torture in itself. And then you're being bed bathed. You can't go to the toilet for yourself. All of those sorts of things. So there's a loss of identity there, and a big ego hit, I suppose, from being very self-reliant and being known for being physical and help other people out, and all of a sudden everyone's doing everything for you. So there were some dark moments in those early days, but then as soon as I saw any progress with it, like the toe wiggling and seeing there was something to work towards, I just latched onto that as a distraction almost, and then just spent every day trying to do something that would improve my current situation. And I quickly realized that the only way to get better was to stay present, because I couldn't affect the outcome if I was just worrying about where I was going to end up in the future, or what I could have done differently to not dive in the pool, like living in regret and living in the past. And that was where I was, to answer your question to start with. I was, feeling sorry for myself, really, victim mindset. Why me? And it wasn't until I moved to the spinal unit after 12 weeks. No, how long was it? 7 or 8 weeks. I moved to the spinal unit, and I'd been sort of in a side room in my own bubble. And then all of a sudden you're on a ward with 30, 40 other people with varying levels of injury, some of whom are better off than you, but a lot of whom aren't. And some have permanent tracheotomies in. They're going to have full-time care for the rest of their life. They've got complete injuries, no scope for recovery. And all of a sudden you're like, hang on a minute. I've got an actual opportunity to get a little bit better here. These people don't. What right have I got to feel hard done by the situation? And I knew how lucky I was to still be alive. And then just by focusing on that and just focusing on what I could do each day, and being grateful, having that gratitude for having the opportunity to even work towards something, no matter how uncertain the outcome was, helped me to stay in a more positive mindset. And don't get me wrong, it's a work in progress, and it always is. Like, it's your brain will naturally gravitate towards the negative. That's how we're wired up biologically. But being able to practice those things and remember and reflect and interact with people who aren't necessarily in as good a place as you, or have the opportunities that you've got, really helped with my own recovery.
That mindfulness piece and the bit of, again, the perspective, the gratitude, the mindfulness, was that something that you had done prior to the accident, or was this something that you were almost like learning on the job and thinking, I've got to figure this out, and then recognize that it had an impact? Or was it something you already pre-knew?
No, it was completely learning on the job. You do a certain amount with sport in terms of sports psychology, but that's all about on-field stuff. It's about focus and bouncing back. It's not about mindfulness and things like that. I suppose they do a little bit more now, but it was a proper crash course in all of those things, and it was just survival mechanism. And it's amazing how many of them come instinctively to you as a human being. And I thought I was sort of working all these things out myself. And then since that, I became fascinated in that side of things and the psychology behind it. And you realize that they're all researched, pre-existing models and techniques that I was just working out naturally. So that was quite interesting for me. That has been interesting for me since. And I know the title of my book's Lucky, and that was because in the blogs I was keeping, the diaries I was keeping for hospital, the publisher literally said to me, you used the word lucky 42 times in your first 100 days. Do you not think that's a bit weird considering you just broke your neck? And I was like, yeah, that is. Like, why is that? And like digging into it, that reframing element as a coping mechanism, that perspective shift, because your brain knows if it stays in the negative, then you're going to be hampering your chances of making a physical recovery because of that mind-body connection as well. So I was naturally reframing it. I was always looking at the positive side, but only because I think is a survival technique. But then if you do that enough over a long enough period, it becomes innate. And to the point now where my wife despairs of me being constantly positive and reframing things all the time, but I catch myself doing it. I'm like, even if someone's cutting you up in the car, you're like, oh, well, they must be having a bad day. At least it's a chance for me to work on my, self-control. Like, how is there anything good about that?
I mean, you're totally where I am now. And that's it is almost an annoyance for the people around you. After my retirement, I had the same thing. I traveled and taught. I traveled to Hawaii to teach myself and become to qualify in these areas, and it was something that I thought, okay, man, I'll do it because I feel like it's this thing I've heard about. But then when you come back, and then it takes sort of a few more years and time and experiences to go, okay, this is actually where it's from, and this is what I can use it in. Like you said, someone cutting you up. Like I don't get angry anymore at them, and I almost look at that experience and go, you should be getting angry, but you're not getting angry. So what's going on there?
Yeah.
And I think one of the things I found fascinating is this lack of victim mentality that you ended up having, because it is, again, I'm sure there may have been a few people in that ward that wouldn't have gone down the path that you had and fell into, okay, well, I'm going to lean on this accident that's happened to me, my situation right now, and what I can't do in life. Do you think either these practices lent to not getting into that victim mentality, or do you think there was something else that you had perhaps lent on from being an athlete, being a pro before that?
I think it's like not a perfect storm, but it's just like everything's added into the concoction of it. Being in professional sport or sport in general naturally helps you build resilience because, it's a bit of a roller coaster. You're not just winning every week. There's selection, injuries, you don't know where your next contract's going to come from, all of these sorts of things. And if you dwell too much on a bad game, it's going to affect your performance next week. You have to learn to let go of things. And the same if you have a good game, you have to learn to let go of that to a certain degree as well and focus on the next thing. You can't sit on your laurels. And I think that helped me with my own recovery because it was a bit of a roller coaster. So that's probably one of the main elements from sport, as well as the teamwork side of things, because recovering from something like this isn't just an individual thing. You've got to rely on physios, doctors, family, and I kind of recognized that early on. And in a weird way, as much as they were motivating me, I was deliberately trying to motivate them because, if the team around you is positive and driven, then that was going to benefit me too. So they were the kind of things I'd already realized from sport. But then like shifting out of the victim mindset was as much of a distraction, I think, in terms of it ended up me switching out of the victim mindset. But it was like, okay, I can't stay in this position. So things like mindfulness, constructive distractions as well. So focusing intensely on the processes so that I didn't have time to sit there and ponder, the meaning of all of this. Why did this happen? And then as I got further down the line and I was making a recovery, I also looked at that gratitude piece, reflecting, looking the other way, not just looking up. I think in life we're quite guilty of looking at the things we haven't got and not appreciating the things we have. And when you spend time with people who don't have as much as you, then you start to feel more grateful about your own situation. And I definitely started to feel that too. And then in time, that all just sort of added up to me now being in a position where I do feel incredibly grateful. And it's easier for me to be there now because of what has transpired. Like I have a life now way more full of purpose than I ever had, even as a professional player. I'm in a position where I am independent and I can go to the mountains and take on challenges, but running this charity and actually having a positive impact on other people's lives is something that wouldn't have come about if I didn't dive into the wrong end of a swimming pool. And I think there was a moment where I realized about a year after my accident when I climbed Snowdon, and there were all these people who came to support and said that my journey was really helping them. And I really felt like some good was coming out of it. And I thought, actually, if enough good comes out of this situation for other people, then by definition, it turns from a bad situation to a good situation, a bad moment to a good moment when I dived in the pool. Because if enough good has come out of it, I shouldn't go back and say, I wish I hadn't dived in the pool because of all this good that's come out of it. And I kind of set off on this path to get for as much good to come out of that day where I dived into the pool and broke my neck and everything that's transpired since, that I would get to a point where it was like, no, I wouldn't take it back. And, that happened actually quicker than I thought. So I don't have any regret about it anymore. So there is no victim mindset at all. In fact, I feel grateful for it, which was an interesting and counterintuitive place to get to when I got there, but it's real. I fully feel it.
Yeah, I want to come back to you finding purpose now and almost having more purpose now than you did before the accident. But just on that whole sort of not getting yourself going and taking that progress, I think you mentioned it with rehab earlier on about if you have a habit and you have a routine, it can kind of just like be the thing that forces you out and like, okay, I've just got to carry on doing that. I think a lot of people trying to find that habit, trying to find that routine. I think this is a really good example of where it can play in, obviously not with the severity of the injury, but it could be someone who, I don't know, does an ankle or like tears a hamstring, right, in sport, or is just a really avid runner and just finds themselves having a bit of layoff. I think the habits and the routines are the things that allow you to not dwell so much in the situation that you're in. It just gives you like, right, what's my next step that I'm going to take? What's the next footstep that I'm going to take? And it's that one. I think those habits and routines are just the powerful part of that.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And that's one of the layovers as well. That's one of the things I still use day to day, is being able to fall back on those habits and routines to help psychologically get through things. And developed a lot of that in hospital, I suppose. Like there is that routine, just getting out of bed in the morning and doing all the admin around my sort of limitations and the things that I have to do. That they are habits and routines that set your mind up in a certain way that you might have been in a negative mindset going into it, but then you can fall back on those and go through the processes and your brain almost clicks back into what it should do. And that started in hospital, and it's something I continue to this day. Like, it's you know this better than everyone because it keeps getting hammered home in this space anyway, but like the way you start the day dictates the rest of it, and being able to get that right sets the precedent for the rest of the day. And that was the same in my rehab as well, especially early on when there's a lot of dark thoughts going around and a lot of potential holes to fall in psychologically. If you just focused on those goals, like getting everything right in the morning, but then your routines towards your rehab, it helped your brain stay in a more positive space.
So moving on to your purpose now, which is the charity Millimeters to Mountains, and what is the people that you're working with? And obviously we can get onto some of the challenges you've done, which is the Everest up your staircase was the one for me really that completely personified it. But some of the things that you're doing with it? Because actually, I know that Kieran Lowe, who's been on the podcast before, he came on one of your mountain expeditions, didn't he? But explain to people what you do with the charity and sort of the reason behind it.
Yeah, so the reason behind it was effectively because I discovered how much being outdoors and being in the mountains helped me with my recovery, not just physically, but psychologically as well. And I thought, if this has helped me, then it should be able to help other people too. So what we do is we take people who've been through trauma, physical or psychological, who are in a tough place because of that, have maybe sort of found themselves in a rut or going off track in life. And we take them on a big adventure somewhere around the world to help them break out of that rut, but also be around other people who are going through similar issues. They might not be the same issue on paper, but we found the journey through trauma. There's a lot of parallels depending what the root of that trauma is. We've got people who have had spinal cord injuries like myself, or accidents, bereavements. We've got people with PTSD, all sorts of things, but they can all find parallels with each other, and there's almost a healing in that community. But then off the back of the adventure, we realized that just taking people on an amazing trip and then them going back to their lives, it could be quite easy for them to slip back into that mindset, the headspace that they were in before. So we put a 3-year development program in place where we fund retraining, life coaching, therapy, whatever it might be, to help them put the practical steps in place for them to sort of realize that change. And we became a full charity in 2019, got charitable status. We've got 24 beneficiaries in the system, if you like, at the moment. The 3rd year beneficiaries are just finishing, the people who came on in 2019. We've seen some amazing results. And one of the coolest things is they're now all almost unanimously all going on to do things and have careers and on paths to help other people, because in the same way they've been helped. So the ripple effect's been big as well. And yeah, it's amazing, just being able to have a positive impact on one person's life can be life-changing for someone, but to be actively involved in helping other people. And it doesn't always work in respect to, we get a lot of applications, and we can't take everyone on, and sometimes it's not easy to deal with that, but you can't help everyone. And just the privilege of being around someone who can turn their life around, and you've had a small part to play in it, is pretty amazing, and something I'd never really experienced before. I wouldn't say I was uncharitable before, but the extent of it was putting some money in buckets every now and again, or going to a charity dinner and bidding on something and hoping you didn't win it because you wouldn't be able to afford it, that sort of thing. And now it's like having an actual involved impact in people, part of people's recovery. So it's pretty amazing.
Well, that selfless act sometimes can feel selfish, but it isn't, because it does make you, it's good for you, like, right, that feeling of helping others. And I get it now with the work that I do. I feel my purpose is towards that. And the thing I'm actually interested to ask someone like yourself with this question is, before you got the accident and you're in the situation you're in now, where you have this higher purpose to your work, do you think if you had something like that when you were a player, that you'd have played better?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, right.
When I started studying, that was something I was terrified of. I took till 25. Like, I think I was the last generation to come through when we were actively advised not to go to university because it would be a distraction. Obviously, that's changed now. But I reluctantly, because I got to 25 and I saw my peers all having to retire because of injuries, and I thought I better do something. So I did a leadership and management degree set up through the RPA, and I actually surprised myself and found that I absolutely loved studying again. But that was just because it was a constructive distraction away from sport, and it helped me on that process I spoke about earlier of not getting too high on the highs or too low on the lows, and gave me a distraction away from the sport, and actually made me better on the pitch. So when I finished that, I carried on and did a master's, but for no other reason than to help me be a better rugby player. Which, if you told me that at 18, 19, I was like, no way, you've got to be fully head in the game. You've got to, commit yourself 100% to the sport. But it can be further from the truth. Like, if you're in a better headspace, with a more well-rounded, healthy lifestyle, psychologically and physically, obviously, it will benefit on the pitch. And I think one of the quickest hacks you can get for being more grateful, for living a life with more gratitude, and then having a more positive mindset, is by engaging in that space, not just looking up and ahead and where we want to get to, or other people that have got more than us, but engaging in, say, a charitable space, donating some time to a charity, whether it be picking up the phone and spending some time speaking to people through Samaritans, or just doing one day a month. It doesn't have to be much, but it's a good grounding tool to give yourself perspective on the rest of your life and how lucky you are to be in the position you're in. So you're not just helping people who might not be in as a fortunate situation as you. You're helping yourself too, because it's giving you more perspective on your own life.
I think you ease everything off as well. Like you make everything a little bit, not necessarily easier, but that mindset of being like, I have to focus on this, I'm going to solely be focused on that. It feels like quite a scared mindset to be in. It feels like if I don't do this, then I'm going to lose it. And I think, well, if you were to sort of fill your buckets up around your life, then you'd probably feel at ease a little bit more with the fact that if in the occasion that this doesn't work out, or you face an injury and it does come to an end, then you're still a rounded human being to do something else in life and still have that bigger purpose, that bigger impact in whatever it is you're going. Because regardless, if you have a healthy career or not, it is coming to an end. Like whether you're 45 or 40 or 35 or 30 or 25, right? It's going to come to an end and it's finite. So I think you just help yourself, and you can do that by helping others. And you're a great example now of being able to do that through what you do now. You're many different expeditions you're doing, but the during COVID, I was in Australia when COVID was happening, and I saw through social media, I was watching your climb of Everest up your staircase, and it was crazy. I mean, I actually found the numbers, and it was 89,056 steps that you were taking. And how did you get through that? Like, did you just break it down? Did you set mini goals? How did you go through that whole challenge?
Well, like most things, it was I didn't put much thought into it before I announced it, and then it was working it out afterwards. And I think if I knew how much it was going to be, I probably wouldn't have committed to it in the first place. So it was 12 hours a day for 4 days, going up and down my parents' staircase, and it was 89,000 step ups. But I've only got one leg to use, so it was 89,000 single leg step ups
on one leg.
So it was. Do you know what? Physically, it was tough, but it was more the psychological side of things, because in the mountains, you've got stuff to look at. You know, there's nice views and people to talk to. But for this, it was just me and my parents' bathroom at one end and the fridge at the other. So it was, but do you know what? It was one of those things that if we'd raised a couple of £100, I would have been livid. But I got some traction because it was so ridiculous, and because it was during lockdown and no one had anything better to do. And one of the thinkings behind it was actually to give people something positive to watch, and we put Instagram lives over the evening and morning news, because at that point everyone was just waiting to see what the death toll would be, and it was just like, you don't need to fill your head with any more negativity. We all know what we need to do, which is stay inside. So it's quite simple. The rules were at that point. So it was like, well, let's have a laugh. So we were doing Insta lives with like mates coming on to DJ, and then it got out of control because like Red Bull picked up on it and posted something, and then it went a bit viral, and then we started raising lots of money. Next thing I know, I'm like on Insta lives with like Joe Wicks and like so Chris Bonington, who's like really famous British mountaineer expert. He's in his 80s now. First ascents on the south face of Everest and all these sorts of things. He was giving me advice on how to summit Everest when I was 10 flights from the top. And I was like, this has got completely out of hand now. But we raised 50 grand, and it was, and as painful as it was, and as much as I wrecked my parents' staircase, it was definitely worth doing.
It's unbelievable. I mean, it was just such a cool feat. Look, I'm very cautious of time, and I don't want to keep you for too much longer. I really appreciate your time. What's coming up for you? What's the next thing for you? Well,
seeing as we're talking about silly challenges, I'm going to carry a Christmas tree to the top of the highest mountain in the central US states, Mount Whitney, for Christmas. We're looking to summit the day before Christmas Eve, and we've got sponsored baubles. So again, that's just like a bit of fun. But hopefully raise some money for a good cause. We're raising money for Millimeters to Mountains, but we're also going to raise money for My Name's Doddy Weir's Foundation, because obviously he's just passed away. He had quite a big impact on my life whilst he was alive. I was lucky enough to meet him a fair few times, and we actually got awarded. The first time I met Doddy was at the RPA Awards, big rugby awards, and we got awarded the same thing at the same time. So we sat on the same table, and he made me drink 12 pints of Guinness before we went up and did our acceptance speech. And then when we stood up to walk over, I was like, "Oh, Doddy, you've completely and you're not going to say no to Doddy Weir. Like if you ever met him, it was just." he was just this character. And I stood up, I was like, oh, you've completely screwed me over here. Or both of us over, because you've got to give an acceptance speech as well. He was like, well, the difference is everyone's going to know you're pissed. Everyone else thinks it's just my motor neuron disease. Cheers, mate.
Oh my God.
So it was really sad to hear he passed away this week. So it'd be nice to do something for him. But in terms of bigger challenges, I'm doing an ice cap crossing next year of our largest ice cap in Europe, which is in Iceland, with the first full disability team. So it's 3 of us with spinal cord injuries, one of whom's in a wheelchair. So that's going to be an interesting thing. We just got back from a training trip, actually, learning how to get a wheelchair out of a crevasse, which has never been done before. And turns out it's basically impossible. So we've just got to avoid crevasses. So that'll be interesting. And then later on, back end of next year, I'm going back to the Himalayas to try and break a height record. So more news on that to come. But yeah, lots of exciting stuff in the pipeline.
That's amazing. What's your just whilst I've got someone who's from the sport in rugby, what's your sort of take on what's going on in the sport at the moment? There's a lot of financial issues going on, and there's also, there's a lot of conversation around things like CTE, and that's obviously synonymous with both rugby and NFL. And what's sort of your take on that?
Yeah, well, so first of all, the CTE thing, I think, it's a bit worrying. I suppose the way I used to play as well, I was played in a position where I've been concussed more times than I can remember during my 10-year career. So seeing the players come forward is quite sad. It is sad. I know a few of the players. We actually had Michael Littman staying with us recently because he's a good friend of mine when he was back over at Bath, and his short-term memory is pretty shot. So it is hard to watch. I think it actually I hope to think it got sorted out about 10 or 12 years ago when the laws changed. A lot hotter on it now in terms of concussions. They have independent referees and doctors who will pull people off after watching footage live. When they're watching the game live, they can call people off the pitch. And the return to play protocols are pretty intense. And also, the main issue isn't necessarily the games, it's training, because it's the repeated movement in the head. So they've limited contact in training. Having said that, the players who have been affected are the ones that none of that had been picked up. So I think enough has been done now to mitigate it, hopefully, so that hopefully the issues we won't see them just get worse and worse and worse as these generations start to retire. But of course, it's always concerning, any contact sport. And at least now, I think players can go into it making a more educated decision because they know the consequences, whereas back then it was just, crack on, we'll see what happens. Yeah. We hadn't really had any cases of it. In terms of rugby as a whole, tricky situation at the moment. It's in a bit of a transition. I think it overextended itself. Too many rich owners and just too big a salaries, and there's just not the numbers to support it in terms of the size of the support and the gate numbers. So I think there is going to have to be some structural changes, and unfortunately that's come anyway with the likes of Worcester and Wasps falling out of the Premiership. It's sad it happened to happen like that because there's a lot of players left in limbo now from those two clubs. Obviously the key players have gone on, or the more senior players, or they've gone on and picked up other clubs, but there's still a squad of 40 to 50 boys there, and a lot of them aren't in positions to carry on, and there's not a league to drop down into, really. The Championship isn't what it used to be. I think there's a couple of fully professional clubs there that'd be worth going to if you're a Premiership player, but either way it's going to be a massive salary hit, and with the cost of living crisis and all of those sorts of things, there's a lot of players looking for new careers now, and it happened at the drop of a hat, and actually because of the result of some really poor management on the business side. So that's a shame to see, but it's forced reform. I think that we'll see the Premiership becoming a little bit smaller and wages taking a bit of a hit, but they'd probably overextended themselves in the first place. But the state of the sport on the pitch is really good. The Premiership's never been more competitive. Like, the standard of the Premiership is outstanding. Northern Hemisphere teams are doing really well on the global stage now, although England were pretty shocking against South Africa at the weekend. But France and Ireland are 1 and 2 in the world, so the World Cup's going to be great next year, I think. So I think it's just the financial business structuring side of it needs to change, and needed to change for a long time. The actual state of the sport itself, in terms of safety and standard of competition, is in a pretty strong place.
Yeah, awesome. Just to finish on a good note, what is a book, documentary, quote, or a person that you are constantly recommending, other than your own book, by the way? Can't use that one, but something that you're recommending to people that has inspired you?
Well, two big books for me, especially for an early stage, that helped me were Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. It's just mind blowing. It's outstanding. I won't say any more than that. I think just go and read it. I think everyone should read that book. And The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday, which focuses on Stoicism. Stoicism sort of became a big coping mechanism for me, or something that I read into a lot, because, you know, it is about removing those emotions from decisions, seeing things as they are and taking the most positive step forward, as well as letting go of things you can't affect, which of course is quite important in those situations. So they're two I would definitely advise. What did I watch recently? Okay, on a lighter note, have you seen Pepsi Where's My Jet yet on Netflix?
No, not yet.
It is amazing. So it's about this big Pepsi campaign where they promised used to collect Pepsi tokens in the 80s. You could win merchandise like a hat or a jacket. And then on the advert, they said, if you collect 7 million, you can win a Harrier jump jet. And then some kid goes out and makes it his life ambition to get it. And he gets to 7 million. And then there's this massive court case. They didn't put a disclaimer at the bottom. So they all go to court about he wants his jump jet. He wants his Harrier jump jet. But just it's really well made and it's quite funny. It's quite an interesting insight into sort of that world of big business and marketing with a really nice backstory as well. So if you want something current, I'd recommend that.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to jump on that. Ed, thank you so much for your time. Really, really appreciate it. And I'll put all links into the show notes for people where to find you, your website, the charity's website. But just for the moment, thank you for what you're doing, and it's just always inspiring to see an athlete to go from a very tragic incident in their life and turn it into something that's impacting people, because it's very easy to go the other way, and you've made a decision not to. So thank you, and don't stop, mate. Just keep going.
Cheers, Lewis.